This podcast is brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tyres, batteries and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. I didn't have time to call personally on my good friend David Willey. He lives a little bit too far, but is here today with me via Zoom. It's his third time on the Mackay interview. And for those of you not familiar with his name, he still is, after more than 40 years, regarded as the definitive voice of the BBC from Rome, the Vatican and the Holy See. David, welcome back to the Mackay interview. It's good to have you with us again, even if it's only via Zoom.
Thank you very much. It's a great honour to do the last broadcast of the season. And I was recalling when I first began reporting from Rome. I think I've lived most of my adult life in Rome and came here for the first time as a student when I was amazed to see, I actually saw Pope Pius XII in his final years being carried at the Vatican in this sedia gestatoria, this chair which he was traditionally, popes for centuries had been carried around. They weren't allowed.
I remember.
And he was flanked by flunkies in what looked to me like fancy dress, with ostrich plumes waving at the back of their heads. And it was an amazing ritual. Well, of course, he was the last pope to wear the papal crown, as it were. They gave up these symbols of kingship, and don't forget that for many years, well, after the foundation of the Italian state, the Kingdom of Italy, in the 19th century, the Pope regarded himself as the prisoner of the Vatican. Yeah. Well, I found all this fascinating when I came for the first time in the 1970s to work in Rome as a BBC correspondent, and then later on in 78, the first ever Polish Pope was elected, and I took off from that point and became rather interested and travelled the world with him and saw the Vatican from a very different point of view, because I found out that you could get closer to the Pope when you were flying 35,000 feet above the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans than you could trying to talk to him in the Vatican itself.
I promise you, when I do eventually retire, that I shall read your books about the popes. I'm fascinated. But David, let's get on with the conversation. I'm really interested in Francis, much loved pope, memorable pope. But was he effective, David, in your book? And what do you think he'll be remembered for, Pope Francis?
Well, I think he will be remembered for having brought to the Vatican a great simplicity. He, of course, took the name of Pope Francis from Saint Francis of Assisi, who was renowned for his love of the poor and the simple life. And I think Pope Francis from Argentina, the first pope from Latin America, trod in the footsteps of Saint Francis, certainly, because he eschewed the paraphernalia of Vatican ritual. For example, when he was taken to see the quarters where he was expected to live on his election, he took one look and saw this enormous penthouse apartment and said, "Good heavens, I'm not going to live here," and went straight back to the Vatican guest house where he'd been living at the election. So I think he continued the simple life for which he'd been known in Buenos Aires. When I wrote a book about him and did some research locally in Buenos Aires and found that his first act on becoming Archbishop there had been to sell off the former Archbishop's splendid mansion and go and live in a couple of rooms next door to the cathedral where he did his own cooking at the weekends.
Really?
And he was certainly attached to a much simpler life than most of his predecessors.
So,
And he brought this love of the poor. He was a great supporter of the so-called worker priests in Buenos Aires, where he was brought up. And I think that he was renowned for travelling on the local metro. He followed this same pattern here in Rome. He had a small Fiat car. He didn't go around in a big limousine.
really, is that true? I didn't know that.
He really practiced what he preached.
So, David, if some were disappointed by what he failed to do, I mean, after all, even though he's the Pope, he's not completely flawless. What would those omissions be, in your opinion?
Well, he really failed, it seems to me, to deal adequately with the problem which emerged during his pontificate of pedophile priests. There was this story first broke in America, in the Diocese of Chicago, where the local Archbishop, Cardinal Law, was forced to resign because he basically covered this up. He shifted his priests who were accused of pedophilia around and tried to hide what was going on. And the Vatican's first attitude to all this was, oh, well, this is an American problem. Well, guess what? It turned out to be a universal problem, not only, of course, in the Catholic Church, also in other religious organizations. It's been discovered that there have been huge cover-ups of pedophile scandals, which continued to this day, particularly here in Italy, where the prosecution of priests accused of pedophilia has been very limited. So Pope Francis set up a committee, as happens with all big organizations, and this committee met, and there were some very worthy people summoned to try to deal with it. But basically, they failed to deal with the worldwide situation, and particularly during a visit to Chile in the South America, where there had been some particularly bad cases of priestly pedophilia. The Pope, first of all, refused to acknowledge the fact that this was taking place at all, and he had to admit that mistakes were made. But the story continues today, and I think this is going to be one of the problems that Pope Leo is going to have to address during his pontificate, which has just begun.
They do seem to have great problems in grasping what is essentially a huge blot.
Another great problem, of course, has been the problem of money. During Pope Francis' pontificate, the voluntary contributions to the support of the Vatican, the Holy See, known as Peter's Pence, principally made by faithful members of the Church in America and in Germany, have been diminishing. For example, the total revenue from Peter's Pence has halved in recent years.
That's a lot.
And the Vatican's running expenses are always increasing because, for example, there is an aging priesthood, and the paying of pensions to Vatican staff is an increasing problem. Although Vatican's city-state is only a very small entity in comparison with most states, the financing is relatively low key. It still has big problems of keeping its deficits under control. It has considerable holdings in real estate and, of course, investments. And then there is an organization. It has its own bank. There is the Vatican Bank, yes, which has just issued its results for the year, showing a very modest profit. But basically, there is, during the big discussions which took place here in Rome during the period running up to the conclave, which elected Pope Leo. One cardinal was reported as saying that the Church was facing a financial disaster, and that the new Pope would have to deal with this. Well, those are very strong words.
Before we get on to Leo, just one last question. The centre of gravity of the Church moves south and east continually. Has it in any way successfully addressed the shortage of priests during Francis's time?
Not really. The number of priests worldwide has diminished by about 10,000. There are about, I think the latest figures are something like 400 and just over 400,000 Catholic priests in the world today, which has remained more or less steady over the past years. In Africa, the number of priests has been growing because there have been an increasing number of vocations for the priesthood. I think one of the limiting factors has been the continued refusal, first of the late Pope John Paul and then his successors, to change the celibacy rule and allow women priests. I think this is another matter that Pope Leo is going to have to decide for himself. Pope John Paul II laid down the rule that the subject was now closed. There would be no women priests in the Catholic Church. But I noticed recently there have been demonstrations by wannabe women priests here in Rome who have been seeking publicity for their cause, even though...
There are two different things there. I wanted to ask you about that. There are two different things. Women priests or priests marrying. I mean, separate the two for me, please.
Okay, well, first of all, there are no marriage is not permitted. Although, interestingly enough, I went to Ukraine some years ago, where the local Catholic Church is known as the Uniate Church. It was tried to Stalin under Soviet rule tried to kill it off, but he didn't succeed. And there's now in Western Ukraine, a quite powerful local Catholic Church, which is in communion with Rome, and their priests, who broke away from Moscow 4 centuries ago, are allowed to marry. You can't marry if you're a bishop in the Uniate Church, but you can marry if you're a priest. And I was somewhat astonished when I visited a local seminary in Ukraine, Catholic seminary, to find out that priests were allowed, that the student priests were allowed to have their girlfriends visit them in their seminary. So it was there is some demand, I would say, among young Catholics for a change in the rules, although whether this will happen during this pontificate, I wouldn't care to say.
Okay, fair enough. And what about same-sex marriage, blessings of same-sex couples, that whole fraught area of LGBTQ people? Has Leo ever expressed a position on that, or was that just not relevant down in Peru, where he spent so much of his time?
No, he has followed the church teaching, which is that the church teaching was expressed in a very dramatic way by his predecessor, Pope Benedict, who called it an intrinsic disorder and made it clear that that homosexuality was to be deplored and not to be encouraged. Pope Francis modified this by issuing his laconic statement, "Who am I to judge?"
Yes, I remember that.
And Pope Leo, I expect, will continue to allow not the blessing of homosexual of marriages by the LGBTQ people, but I think that the future Catholic Church attitude towards homosexuality is going to be considerably more open than it has been in the past. That's all I can say.
I see. Well, today my guest is David Willey, who for more than 40 years has been the definitive voice of the BBC in Vatican, Rome, the Holy See. David, you're living quietly in your retirement in your lovely village not far from Rome. I had the privilege of visiting you there a few years ago. I read recently in certain parts of the north, the wealthy North, European countries and the USA, that there's been an increase in attendance at Mass on Sundays amongst the young. I mean, what vibrations, do the tom-toms tell you about the young people taking an interest in practicing the faith?
Well, the American polling organisation Pew, which follows his affairs, has found that there's been a flight from the church by young people in America. And certainly in Latin America, there's been a flight from the church by people who have been joining evangelical movements. I think certainly there is a problem that the church faces in attracting young people. And I think one of the very interesting things I've noticed during this first month of the pontificate of Pope Leo is his very supportive attitude for sport among young people. He has, one of the first people he met in public was the Italian tennis champion Sinner. It turns out that Pope Leo is not a bad tennis player himself. He's been on the tennis courts consistently over a long period. It's his favourite form of relaxation, and he even exchanged tennis rackets. Really? And with Sinner, and then the Tour the Giro d'Italia, the Italian cycle race, which everybody in Italy follows very closely, had stopped at the Vatican at the beginning of the month to show his support for this form of sport. And I think that Pope Leo regards the sort of values promoted by sport among young people as reflecting the values of the Catholic Church, of community, of social acceptance, of friendship between people of different religious beliefs. And I think he actually has been encouraging. There's a big weekend of sports this weekend, marking the Jubilee. There's going to be a presence in the Vatican of thousands of sports fans who will be attending a papal mass, and they've been holding a press conference at which there's been a famous Italian Paralympic champion, somebody who is paralysed in his knees but has still won prizes in the Paralympics. A woman who's been a champion swimmer. In other words, the Pope is very aware of the fact of the sporting values can often help in creating the sort of world that he is trying to encourage in his pastoral mission.
Yeah, I think he's right. I think he's right about that. But tell me something about Leo. I mean, he's by birth and education an American, even though Peruvian by adoption. Is that going to make any difference to the way he manages the affairs of the Holy See? I mean, what is the expectation of him?
So far, he has been very careful not to make any changes in the way that the Vatican is run. He confirmed everybody in their post at the beginning of his pontificate, and in fact pleased all the 5,000 Vatican employees by giving them a $500 bonus payment to mark the beginning of his papacy. So he will have to change make some very serious new appointments, but he's biding his time. I think he's very careful not to upset the boat. He doesn't want to appear as yet another American coming to do a takeover. Yeah. His profile is certainly very different to that of the political leadership in the United States.
Well, give me some insights into how a pope goes about choosing his management team, and how much of the selection of those closest to him, his cabinet, his executive committee, so to speak, does he craft himself? I'm just curious to know. Or is it all managed for him by the Holy See's civil service top brass?
There is a continuing search in the Vatican for new possible candidates for top jobs in the Vatican. But what I've noticed over the years is that the Vatican still is very much an Italian-led organization, for the simple reason that most of the employees are in fact Italian citizens. Yeah. There are a few top jobs which are held by foreigners who come here normally for a certain period and then leave after 5 or 10 years and continue their ecclesiastical careers in their home country. Yeah. So there's been it still has a very Italian favour, and Italian is certainly the lingua franca of the Vatican. However, the fact that you have the first polyglot pope now in history, able to communicate in his native language, English, and in several other languages as well. Pope Leo, I understand, we know he speaks fluent Spanish from his experience in Peru, but he also speaks Portuguese, French, German, and clearly he can communicate more effectively in English than any of his predecessors. Yes. And indeed, he has already started to insert bits of English in his speeches, but I think he wants to avoid giving the impression that this is yet another American takeover.
I can understand that. Slightly different question, David. He's offered to convene a meeting in search of a peaceful end to the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. And my question to you, is that unprecedented? I mean, and if not, which pope or popes have made similar gestures? And what was the outcome regarding the Vatican being a convener of discussions or meetings of people?
Well, there's a long history of the Vatican, of popes, of previous popes, trying to settle disputes. In the 19th and back in the Middle Ages, of course, you had popes who were leading armies. Yes. The role was rather different. We had warrior popes in those days. Right. But in modern times, the popes have engaged in attempts to settle conflicts in various parts of the world with, I would say, very mixed results. The Pope Francis tried to create an atmosphere of friendship in the Middle East by inviting the leaders of the Palestinians and the Israelis to a day of prayer, but a joint day of prayer never led to anything. And it's interesting that President Putin of Russia, I noticed, called the Pope. He made the initial call to Pope Leo the other day, congratulating him on his election and issuing nice words of friendship. But of course, the relationship between the Eastern Orthodox Church, with its headquarters in Russia, and the Vatican is long and not very friendly. So I don't see any particular big rapprochement going on in which the two rival churches would participate. And I certainly, although the Pope has offered the Vatican as a possible venue for future peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, I don't see much prospect of that taking place in the near future. Although we did have this amazing picture of the Secretary of State of the Vice President of the United States sitting down with President Zelensky when he came to attend the funeral of Pope Francis in the Vatican. That picture went around the world. Good
photographs, yeah.
The outlook is not really very good. I think it's worth noting that all these papal visits which have taken place since John Paul II started travelling the world to bring the faith to go and visit in person the Catholic community worldwide. the two countries that no pope has ever been to are Russia and China, and I think it's likely to remain that way.
Tell me a little bit more about China. I know we talked about this the other day, because China has a very special relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, if I put it that way. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, in China, you've got a rather small Catholic community, maybe 20 million, maybe 15 million. Nobody knows exactly how many. Limited to a rather small part of the country, but still, the communist authorities allow what they call the official Catholic Church to exist, and there is an agreement in force between the Vatican, between the Holy See, and the Chinese government, which allows for the joint approval of bishops. For many years after the communist revolution in China, no bishops were appointed by the Vatican. They were unable to do this. But of course, now in time, there has been a working agreement, I would say. And it was interesting the other day, I noticed that Pope Leo countersigned for the first time the appointment by the Chinese communist authorities of an officially approved Catholic bishop in China, who's now also been approved by the Vatican. But of course, there is also parallel to the official Chinese Catholic Church an underground Catholic Church in China, which meets in secret and has to hide much of its activities and is not in agreement with the Communist Party. So the future of Catholicism in Asia is not in any way assured, except, of course, in traditionally strongly Catholic parts of Asia, such as the Philippines,
yes,
something like 80% Catholic, which has a cardinal here in Rome, giving a very important role.
I've got a couple more questions for you, David. They are rather big questions, but let's try and address them in the last few minutes. The growth of Islam and evangelical Christian churches. How does the Vatican see those?
Well, Islam, Pope Francis was quite keen on trying to advance Catholic-Muslim relations. He signed a document in 2019 called Human Fraternity with the Grand Imam called Ahmed Al-Tayeb, promoting peace and mutual respect. And then in 2021, he visited Iraq and met the Grand Ayatollah there. They issued a statement emphasizing their continued desire to have interfaith dialogue and peaceful coexistence. And then, of course, he went to Indonesia in 2024 and issued a joint declaration there, underscoring shared values between the two faiths. In other words, there have been a lot of official documents signed, although relations between the churches are impeded by the fact that in the Catholic Church you have a clear leadership. You have a Pope and you have the Vatican, whereas in the Muslim world you have a number of diffused leadership. It's a very diffuse leadership, and you don't really know who you're talking to all the time.
And what about evangelical Christian churches?
Well, there again, there's been a big flight from the Catholic Church in traditionally strongly Catholic parts of Latin America, colonized originally by the Spanish. Both in Brazil and in Argentina, you've got large numbers of former Catholics joining evangelical churches. And then, of course, the Lutherans play a big part in church activities in the United States. Although relations seem to be fairly cordial, I think that very often the Catholics lament the fact that there have been so many defections to the evangelical movement, and that the Christian values which are preached by the two churches, although they're in rivalry, very often the Lutherans seem to win out these days.
Last question, David. It's very much linked with what you've just been explaining to me. Did ecumenism make any appreciable steps forward during Francis's time? And if yes, can you give me some examples of, church? When I say church, I'm talking about Christian churches' unity in some shape or ecumenical form coming together. Is there an appetite for more of that in the Vatican? Is that your sense or not?
Well, I think it was important that at the funeral of Pope Francis, there was a very strong ecumenical element. There were the leaders, there were representatives from the leaders of many faiths. There were Jewish leaders, there were evangelicals, there were Baptists. There was representatives of Indian religions. I think that there is a desire in the church to show an openness to other religions, but I think that the movement, the ecumenical movement in general, is subject to great reservations. The church militant, as it were, is seen, particularly from the Vatican's point of view, as being in strong expansion in many parts of the developing world. And I think that one of the results of the papacy of Pope Francis, the 11-year papacy of the first pope from Latin America, has been an opening towards the South. There is certainly a view now in the Vatican that the universal church, which hitherto has been dominated by Europeans, particularly in the Middle Ages by the French and Italians, and then latterly by Western Europeans and by North Americans, the leadership of the church is moving south, and the future of the church lies in a much more truly international church rather than one which is dominated by Italians and Europeans. The Pope Francis was very keen on talking about the periphery, and I think one of his achievements will come to be seen as having broadened the leadership of the church. In other words, having brought in new cardinals from many countries which previously had never even dreamed. They have small Catholic communities, and they would never have dreamt of having a cardinal of their own. Well, now there are cardinals from Myanmar, even from a country which has less than 0.5%. Well, only a few thousand Catholics, like Mongolia, where there is now basically there is an Italian cardinal in charge. But his words were the importance of the periphery.
Yes.
In other words, Catholic communities don't necessarily have to be dominant in their countries. They can exist anywhere, and they must be supported everywhere.
Yeah, very positive. God bless him, and the effect that he had on moving the church forward. David, thanks. You always bring so many precise and interesting explanations to such long-standing issues. I thank you for spending time with me today. My guest today has been David Willey, for many, many decades, the definitive voice of the BBC from the Holy See, from the Vatican, from Rome. David, thanks. Keep well. Good to see you, and we hope to see you again.
It's been a pleasure, and good luck with the future of broadcasting.
Thanks for listening to the Mackay Interview podcast, brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tyres, batteries and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. And you can find more podcasts on Anchor FM. Just Google Mackay Interview Anchor FM. Thanks again for listening.